How did our ancestors celebrate Lúnasa? Well, Tailtiu agus Fáilte. Hi, hello and welcome. I'm Jon O'Sullivan from the Irish Pagan School, Irish Shanachie storyteller, bard and pagan priest. And I'm going to do my best to not just tell you what our ancestors did, but maybe give you an insight as to why and why it was important. For many people who follow a more modern or neo-pagan structure, providing the wheel of the year, for example, the word that is actually used in the wheel of the year is a practice known as Lammas. Lammas is not Lúnasa. They are 100% entirely different things. Lammas comes from English cultural beliefs. It is like quiet loaf of bread, a corn dolly, sitting at home and honoring a process, and it's done and dusted over at night and a day. That's not Lúnasa. Lúnasa is a much, much bigger, more, and I'm not saying better. It's like an entirely different practice from an entirely different culture, based on a broader set of circumstances than just a personal quiet arrangement. So I'm not knocking Lammas, and people absolutely follow and engage in your spirituality the way you feel you should, but don't conflate Lammas and Lúnasa. And that's the first thing, really, the first piece of misinformation, that people try and think that the words are interchangeable, but they're really, really not. Lúnasa is a lot older. We have records of Lúnasa going all the way back into our mythological era, because it's not just a harvest period or a gathering. It's actually named for the god Lugh. Now, I did a video for the god Lugh over there on in our channels. Like, you'll be able to find it. I'll probably throw a link to it down the bottom as well. But Lugh was king in Ireland for 40 years after our second battle of Moytura during our mythological period. He's one of the Tuatha Dé Danann, one of the gods of Ireland, and he's very, very fascinating for knowing him himself. Oh, by the way, the other video, he's not a solar deity, so I will just bop that in there as well. It's another piece of the misinformation that we try and correct. So Lugh was king in Ireland, and at the time when his foster mother, a goddess known as Tailtiu, who passed away, he decided to honor her memory by hosting what was called a funeral games, and they then carried his name afterwards, known as the Lúnasa Games. Now, it wasn't just a bit of sport and a bit of crack and let's just have an athletic fun day out. It was core to community to gather at that time, to come together and to exchange support and celebrate and honor what is the harvest time. And so Lúnasa sits within harvest period. Now, in Ireland, in the Northern Hemisphere, you're talking July, August, end of July into the period of August. In fact, the entire month of August still to this day bears the name Lúnasa on it. This isn't some ancient archaic practice. The roots of it are still very, very real here. It was also a big time of year, July, for what was known as the ending of hunger, or the last of the hungry days, because throughout the year you've been planting at in bulk, you've been doing your preparing and your growing through Bealtaine, but your harvest hasn't actually come in when you approach Lúnasa. Lúnasa is the start of the harvest period, and in a lot of traditions and practices, you wouldn't actually harvest at all. It was bad form, bad luck, bad energy to pull your first potatoes or to reap your first harvest before you actually hit the Lúnasa transfer, which was generally around the 1st of August. So when you're running into July, you haven't brought in your harvest yet. The stores you've laid in from the last year's harvest and what you've been able to forage or hunt within the landscape is beginning to dwindle down. So there's a hungry time that happens at July before you bring the harvest. But then the important aspect of Lúnasa being a harvest means that you do begin your abundance. You bring in everything that you've laid down, your crops are brought in, and you begin to not just lay in your supplies for the next year, but you also then get to feed your hunger. You get to engage and to share and to fill yourself, which at the end, I actually had a really good conversation about this with a friend and colleague at our local pagan moot here, the biology of it. So I will loop back to that, remind me. But it wasn't just one event. It was actually all over the island. And every community, every Tuatha, every tribe would take this time to come together. In fact, it was also the time when there would be a round of what was known as oenachs. And an oenach was a gathering called by kings. And it would be a kind of a kingship gathering within your own tribe, but would also be a gathering between different tuas, tribes, or kingships for the purposes of oathing and agreements and promises. It was a time of year where, you know, a lot of coupling and engagement would be happening. People would be seeking prospects and mates, some of which could lead to marriage, which then you would have your partner going into the darker, quieter time of the year before it comes back around. And children conceived around Lúnasa would be born around Imbolc, which again, Imbolc, another word for Imbolc is in the belly, or like, in the, yeah, it's kind of the arrival of springtime and new life. So again, that doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a really fun time at Lúnasa. But there was a lot kind of built into the practice of Lúnasa. As I said, like you'd have your oenachs, your gatherings, and as you began to get beyond the day of Lúnasa and go into your harvest, it's when you would bring in what you would owe to your lords or your chieftains for your fealty, paying your rents in essence. Like the feudal system in Ireland was that the lord would give wealth or a parcel of land or the beginnings of crop and cattle to someone who would then raise that, and then once their harvest came in, they would pay a tithe or a portion of that back to their lord. That was done at Lúnasa when they brought in their harvest from the year of effort. But it was also very much about, you know, sharing in the food, sharing in the abundance, like, consuming the food that you're going to need to build yourself up for the quiet times when stuff isn't going to grow. Now, I'm rambling back over a couple of same points. I'm going to look down at my notes here. Oh, yeah. It was actually, there was a practice at Lúnasa that on the day of Lúnasa, when you did actually begin your harvest, you would take the very first bushel that you would harvest. You would straight away get the grain off it. You then take the hay or the straw. You then use the straw. You'd burn the straw to dry out that grain. You'd then mill that grain, and then you'd turn that flour into bread, a first loaf of bread, on the very day. So the day that you harvest your first grain, you would make your first loaf of bread and you would consume that first loaf of bread. And that was, again, that energetic connection with the process. It was so common that and this is a lovely piece of information, in 1634, the Dublin Parliament made it illegal to do that. Now, we were still under the control of, our colonizing force. So, of course, yes, why you don't get to take your first grain and consume it yourself. No, all the grain has to go to your landowners and landlords. But yeah, in 1634, it was actually made illegal to actually make your first loaf of bread from the grain that you grew in your land. Because, of course, the grain wasn't, sorry, during our colonized period, everything that was of value from Ireland, from the land, was exported for the wealth of other colonial interests. But yeah, the heart of the parish, the heart of the festival was coming together, and it was still done into the more modern era where parishes would still gather. And at one point, there was a record of 78 different hilltops where gatherings would happen at Lúnasa. There'd be bonfires, people would come together, there'd be sharing, there'd be song, there'd be dance, there'd be games, and there would be revels. Very famously, one of the more famous places, which still has in somewhat of a Lúnasa honouring, is actually known as Croagh Patrick. Croagh Patrick is one of the mountains in Ireland, and still now on the last day of July, first day of August, there is a pilgrimage or a climbing of Croagh Patrick, and some people choose to honour an older challenge, which is to do that barefoot, to go up and come back down the mountain in just bare feet. Now, that was actually one of the sites of Lúnasa gatherings. So before even Christianity, before Patrick and all the rest of it, it was still a place where people would come and they would climb and they would gather. We've been doing this for a very, very long time, and it's core to part of the culture and part of our expression of self to engage in these community-based circumstances. And like the fairs, there was horse racing, like, again, well, how did they celebrate? This is where I need to get into it. When we talk about games, it wasn't just let's have a bit of sport and have a little bit of a fun day out. It was actually a test of skill. There was an opportunity to come together as a community and to show your skill, to show your talents, which wasn't always horse racing, foot racing. It was actually poetry. It was singing songs. It was telling tales. It was sharing the crafts that you have engaged in. It was displaying there's an Irish concept. It's called excellence. The Irish word has slipped my brain at the moment, but every person would have some form of excellence about them, and this was your opportunity to show your excellence in front of the rest of the community, and to engage and to connect and to share in all of the excellence of everyone else that you share with, which I think is an amazing thing to be aware of and to honor. So there were a number of different fairs all over the country. Very famously, Tailtiu, as I said, was the goddess who fostered Lugh, the oenachs, and Tailtiu, there's a place that now still a place called Tailtown, which is Tailtiu Town, which held and carried on Lúnasa games for a very, very long period of time. It did, again, with the colonization and the forced eradication of Irish culture done by our oppressive imperialistic neighbors. Um, a lot of the stuff, the revels and the practices were like put away or put down or stopped because why would you let people engage in their culture if you're trying to dominate them? But still, some of them did remain. And I have a record here that the Annals of the Four Masters is kind of a pseudo, well, no, actually it is. It's kind of, it bridges the mythological and the historical as a document. So when we look at the Annals of the Four Masters, like it comes from medieval periods and more modern, but it does also touch on histories as opposed to mythological stories. And there's a record in the Annals of the Four Masters from 1166 that said that the line of horses and vehicles stretched for 6 miles long to try and get to the Tailtiu Fair, to the Lúnasa Games at Tailtiu. So 6 miles long from 1168. Also, there was the Fair of Carmun, which is described in a long poem in the Metrical Dinhenicus. The Metrical Dinhenicus is the lore of names and places. So it's this long, long document which has all of these small little poems and excerpts that name and describe locations. So there's actually a specific poem in the Metrical Dinhenicus which talks about the Fair of Carmun and the crowds and kings and foreign merchants and the games and the music that was done at that time. The fact that the Lúnasa Games was such an important thing in Ireland at that time, it would draw the foreign trade, and that's why I wanted to include that in our records, because Lúnasa was celebrated in the island, but also it was so well known that people would come to bring their trade to these Lúnasa gatherings in at that time of year. Not to be outdone and not to be forgotten, even now, still in Killorglin in County Kerry, there's a gathering around this time of year known as the Puck Fair, and very famously, you'd have crowning the king of the fair, which is a goat. So there's a goat competition, and the best goat is judged to be the king of the Puck Fair. And so this was also part of the husbandry, the skills. You would then bring your cattle, you bring your beasts, bring what you have bred and reared, and there will be judgments and checking. So still now, right now, 1st and 2nd of August, if you happen to come to Ireland, you can go to Killorglin and Kerry and go to the Puck Fair, which is, to my mind, an honouring of the Lúnasa tradition right down to today. So there was a lot of very particular, and this is where we get into the more why aspects of it. Like, why would you do these things? Why did our ancestors do this? There's records that the cattle, your whatever it was, mainly your cows, but it could be also your sheep or whatever your other cattle you have, would be driven through lakes and rivers at this time of year. And that was a cleansing effort. It was to cleanse them and protect them and to make sure that they are ready for the wintering that they are going to go through. Much of the same at Bealtaine, where they'd come out of like storage and they would be passed through flames to purify them before they go up into the mountains. Once you're getting down into the Lúnasa period, they're coming down out of the mountains, they're being cleansed and washed by running them through lakes, and then, settled back into their community-based storage and feedings. One of the interesting offerings that was done at that time, it was something known as the clad im, which was a block of butter, really, and that would be thrown into the lake as the cattle was going through, and that was believed to generate more milk and butter offerings from your cattle because they have been blessed by butter by going through the lake. Other things that we talk about is the fact that there was a particular kind of food, actually, and I found this as a reference, and I thought it was really, really awesome. It was known as freachan. So because you're coming out of that hungry time and preparing to go into your harvest and your fullness, a lot of the berries, of course, in the wild areas will have bloomed and grown, so you could actually get your first harvest of berries. So it was known that there was this particular meal that was had called freachan, and I will make sure that spelling is there, but it was a gathering of all like wild bilberries, blackberries, any kind of berries that have grown on the bushes, and then that was mashed all together with like clads of cream. And so that was a specific meal that was had at this time of year. Now, to loop back to that conversation I had with a good friend of mine about it at the local pagan moot, I was talking about all these practices and all this information that we had, and they had a moment. She sat back and she was like, "That actually makes a lot of sense," because she said that if you think of all of these foods, so there are some foods that you would be able to store. You'd be able to smoke or salt. You'd be able to dry or like put away to create your stores for the next year. But of course, there'll be some food that will be perishable that you just have to consume then and there. Like if cattle was not going to survive to the next year, it was butchered and cooked and you would consume it. All of these berries wouldn't survive the next year, so you would then consume it. Any of the fruits that couldn't be dried, you'd consume them. And that's where the whole feeding comes from, and the large celebrations of consuming the end of hunger as you move into the harvest. But she turned around and said, if you think about it, all of the sweets, all of the sweet, sugary fruits that would be consumed would spike a body's insulin. And when the body spikes insulin, it's an indicator to the body that it may need to lay in fat. And so we're sitting there having this banter, and I'm just blown away. She has made this amazing, amazing point that literally the Lúnasa feasting period was laying in the body fat that you would then need to survive the leaner, quieter times, the darker times when stuff wouldn't really grow, and that you would then like need to subsist on what you had dried and what you had prepared and laid in. The mechanism of like Lúnasa celebrations, it wasn't just feasting for feasting's sake. It was actually a somewhat biological imperative to lay in the fat stores in yourself that you're going to need to survive through that darker times. And so, like, I absolutely love talking about this content with you folk here, but also anyone else around me, because sharing in those perspectives really gives a great insight, which is why I also love coming here and doing these talks with you here. Yeah, to avoid a ramble and to going back over it all again, Lúnasa was not Lammas. Lúnasa was community. It was gatherings. It was a big, long period of celebrations. It was honoring your oaths and your agreements, paying your debts to your like landlords or your chieftains or kings, what you owe them, and then preparing and laying in your harvest and your wealth for the darker times that are going to come. Oh yeah, it was also an opportunity to display your excellence, to revel in the art and the skill and the abilities of you, yourself, and the other people that you share in your community spaces. Lúnasa is not Lammas. Lammas, a quiet practice of bread at home in your own home. Yeah, absolutely, if you want to do that, but do not confuse or conflate them with Lúnasa, because Lúnasa, following the name of the god Lughh, the oenachs, he of the many interlinked talents, was an expression of skill and talent and abilities, but also community and gathering and revel. Yeah, I think that kind of answers, hopefully, that answers it. If you have any further questions on this, do fire it into the comments wherever you happen to be seeing this. I absolutely love the opportunity to come back and chat about this with you. But if you wanted to take something from this video or something more to engage in a Lúnasa practice for yourself, we have a resource available. I'll throw the link down below. But if you go to irishpagan.school/Lúnasa, and that's spelled Lunasa, that's irishpagan.school/Lúnasa, you can download a free resource, which will give you just a little PDF and say, okay, well, here's things that you can actually do now in your modern day to honor the ancient Lúnasa practices. Until next time, look after yourself, take care, slán, goodbye.